Hi everyone. If this is the first devlog from the series that you're watching, I'm making a game where you can release your shadow like that and then swap positions with it. And then there's also these shadow barriers everywhere, and they kill your shadow, and they'll kill you too if you have your shadow absorbed, but if you release your shadow first, now you can walk right through them. I've done a ton of stuff since the last devlog. One of the biggest things I worked on though was switching to OpenGL. And for those that don't know, OpenGL is a somewhat low-level rendering API that lets you program directly to the GPU. Previously, I was using something called Slick 2D for rendering, and it worked okay, but there were some big problems with it. First, it's really old and not maintained, and there's really little documentation and almost no resources for it online. And second, and this was the main reason I switched, was because as far as I can tell, you can't do batch rendering with it, and batch rendering is when you basically you can draw a bunch of things all at the same time. And that means that when I was using Slick, to do rendering, I just had to loop over every game object in the game and render it individually. I'd done a little optimization past this, and like for big blocks of objects, like platforms and shadow barriers, my program would chop these up into big rectangles and then apply a texture to each of them. So this meant for these objects I was able to reduce thousands of draw calls to maybe 10. And just as a side note, it's a really fun problem to try to find an efficient algorithm that will chop up, some kind of shape with sides parallel to the axes into the fewest number of rectangles possible. And if you know a little graph theory, I'd recommend trying this problem out. It's really fun. But this method didn't work when I had to draw more chaotic things like particles. So for particles, I was literally just drawing every single one individually. And it wasn't too slow as is, but I want to add more particles and animations to the game, and I want it to be able to run well on even really crappy computers, because I'm just making a 2D game. There's no reason that it shouldn't be able to run well on those. And finally, another big reason of switching to OpenGL is that the effects that you could do with Slick were limited, and I want to be able to add lots of post-processing and other kinds of effects that may or may not be possible with Slick. And I didn't know anything about OpenGL before this, so I had to figure it all out as I migrated the program, and most of it was just by guessing how to convert the ideas from online resources that were written for C++ into Java, because most things for OpenGL online are for C++. And it mostly went pretty smoothly, but there are a couple things that I still haven't worked out. And so the most annoying thing, which I've been over the past 2 days really been obsessing about, is that every few minutes you get this super small stutter, and it only lasts about 20 to 30 milliseconds, so it's barely noticeable and it doesn't really impact the playability of the game, but I just have no idea what's causing it, and it's been really, really frustrating. It's not some delay in drawing, since the problem still happens when you don't actually draw anything, so it must be from loading the data to the GPU, but I've been really careful about not sending too much data, and I reuse all the buffers and delete them when I'm done with them, so I'm not really sure. The problem gets worse when I don't have the frame rate, so if it's running at 1500 frames per second, then maybe the problem happens every 30 seconds. I thought maybe this meant it was a garbage collection problem, since I was creating a really lot of garbage every frame. But I don't think this is the case now, since I rewrote everything to produce basically zero garbage. And the problem is also really weirdly worse on screens where I'm barely loading anything new. There's some screens I'm loading a ton of stuff to the GPU every frame, but the problem is the worst on the first couple of screens, where basically the only thing I'm doing every frame for rendering is updating the player's position and texture coordinates for the player sprite, and then maybe the position of a few dust particles, but the problem still happens even if I get rid of all the particle effects. So I have no idea what's causing the issue, but I hope it's just some stupid single line of code that I'm misunderstanding what it does because I'm new to OpenGL.
and like I'm guessing it's probably something like that because like the actual rendering that I'm doing right now isn't that complicated. And the other issue that came up with OpenGL is that the outline of the shadow spray ends up looking a little weird, and you sometimes get this tiny little flickering in the corner. And the player sprite also kind of had a similar problem, but it only seemed to happen when the player had integer coordinates relative to like the pixels. So I fixed that one with the somewhat hacky solution of just shifting the player's X position by 0.001 pixels for drawing, and that made it go away. Other than these issues, OpenGL has been working pretty well. It's more than doubled the frame rate, and I think it can be increased even more with some obvious optimizations. Also, I'm excited to be able to do more effects. I just learned about frame buffers yesterday, which allows you to draw things to a texture instead of the screen, and these textures can be stored in the GPU and never have to be processed by the CPU, so this allows you to do like big complex effects that evolve over time. I was messing around trying to use this to give more effects to the shadow barriers since they like look pretty bad now. I didn't really come up with anything usable yesterday, but there were a couple things I think look kind of cool, and I'll still like keep exploring to find stuff that looks good.
The next big thing I did was get ready to release a demo of the game for playtesting. I probably should have done this much earlier since I've already made I think somewhere between like 150 and 200 levels, and the demo is basically ready, but I'm holding off releasing it for I think at least a couple weeks. So the demo is just the first area of the game, and I actually really enjoy playing it. So comparing it to like the first area of Celeste, since that's a game that I'm taking a ton of inspiration from, personally I enjoy playing the first area of this game like actually a little bit more. But then a few days ago I bought a controller so I could add controller support for the game for the demo, and I'm really terrible with a controller, like really bad. And so I played the first level of Celeste in this game with the controller. And the first level of Celeste was actually really fun, even though I struggled a lot with it. And the first area of this game, it was similarly difficult, but it wasn't as fun as Celeste. Some of the screens were good, but overall, like, it was decidedly worse than the first area of Celeste. And I think I figured out one of the reasons why this was the case. So the first reason of this game was designed to have a very, like, smooth feel to it. But playing with a controller where I wasn't used to the controls, a lot of the time I wasn't able to keep up with the beats of the level that created the smooth feeling, so that meant that some of the screens like felt more frantic, which was a feeling I was actually specifically not trying to avoid in level design. And if you look at Celeste, the first area, there the pace is much more driven by the player, and when there are multiple inputs you have to hit, they're like really spread apart and have a much more slow and consistent rhythm to them. And the second area of my game actually followed this design a lot closer and was actually pretty good, even with the controller, which I was really bad at. And it was like a little bit disappointing to see that the first area of my game wasn't as fun, but it was a super useful experience to have and be able to play the game where I wasn't comfortable with the controls, and maybe I was experiencing it close to what a new player would experience. So overall this was like a really good thing, and so that's why I'm holding off releasing the demo, since I think a lot of the feedback would be aligned with my own experience playing with the controller. So I'm going to redesign the first area to match this kind of design better, and then I'm going to release the demo. Okay, so that I have some actual content to show, I'll show a secret area of the games I've been making. And yeah, you have to, it's up there in that black thing, but to actually get to it, you have to enter this room with some speed, so I have to start a couple rooms back. So yeah, we have to build up speed from this room. As you'll see, the secret area is really heavily inspired by the Celeste mod glyph. There's a secret area like this in each of the areas of the game, and they're all pretty hard to get into, and they're hard levels, and they all explore rules interactions that are a little more obscure. This one uses the fact that when you jump off a moving platform, you get a speed boost, so it uses that to make you build up a ton of speed.